This episode is sponsored by Lockheed Martin. At Lockheed Martin, veterans are at the center of everything they do. In fact, 1 in 5 of their employees has served in uniform. Lockheed Martin is proud to help men and women like you successfully transition into civilian careers. Join Lockheed Martin and you will find opportunities to take on the same kind of long-term, challenging assignments you tackled while in the military. Whether you're on active duty, transitioning, or already embarking on your civilian career, Lockheed Martin's Military Connect is your online community for professional support. You can find out more at lockheedmartin.bravenew.com. That's lockheedmartin.bravenew.com. Welcome back to Beyond the Uniform. I'm Justin Asiri, and each week I meet with military veterans to learn about their civilian career, what they do, how they got there, and advice for other veterans seeking to do the same. Today's episode number 215 with Chris Koc.
You know, two of the big trends that I see now are as more infrastructure and applications move to the cloud and more businesses see the savings, the aspects of moving their infrastructure to the cloud. Cloud security is becoming a huge part of the whole security field, and a lot of it is working in conjunction with the infrastructure and application specialists who are moving their components to the cloud and trying to fix some of the security vulnerabilities that they have and that they've known about for a while during that move. So they're taking the opportunity as they move their infrastructure and applications to the cloud to fix some of these security holes they have. But they really need to understand how security in the cloud works to make that successful. And that's an easy partnership between infrastructure, applications, and security to make that happen.
I've done several interviews about cybersecurity lately, but Chris is perhaps the most senior person I've spoken with on this subject. As Corporate Vice President of Cyber Incident Response at the New York Life Insurance Company, and as Chief Information Officer previously at 2 separate companies, Chris has a very unique perspective. His story of switching from CIO to focus on cybersecurity and about the incredible growth coming in this field is compelling for anyone even remotely interested in considering cybersecurity as a career path. We also talk about his experience in the reserves and advice to other veterans about considering staying in the reserves. As always, at beyondtheuniform.io, you'll find links in our show notes to every resource we discuss. You'll find over 215 other episodes about veterans' career path and other resources as well. Be sure to check out our coaching program where you can get subsidized coaching in a one-on-one environment to help you determine your career path, values, and goals. And with that, let's dive in to my conversation with Chris Koc. Joining me today in Atlanta, Georgia is Chris Koc. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
So for listeners, I want to give you a quick background on Chris. He is the Corporate Vice President of Cyber Incident Response at the New York Life Insurance Company. He started out in the Army, where he served as a communications officer for over 4 years on active duty. And since his military service, he has worked at Accenture as a technology manager, at the facility group as their chief information officer, LakePoint Sports as their chief information officer, and more. He has served over 21 years in the Army Reserves, retiring at the rank of colonel. And so, Chris, maybe to start things off, I thought one of the things that was really interesting about your story is that you've basically had 3 different transitions from the Army to civilian life. Could you share more about your very first transition from the military and what you wish you had known at the time?
Sure. I made the decision in late 1995 to leave the Army. I was on active duty from 92 to 96. And in 95, the military was going through significant reductions. And the message to junior officers at the time was there really weren't going to be many near-term opportunities, so you may want to look elsewhere. And I won't say that came as a complete shock, but it was definitely disappointing. I took it to heart and dropped my release paperwork in late 95. And by mid-96, I was on my way. That being said, I was stationed in Alaska at the time, so interviewing, and keep in mind this was in the pre-internet world, interviewing was difficult. Even looking for jobs was difficult. My wife and I drove back down the Alcan Highway in 1996 with around 80 days of terminal leave and kind of the outline of a plan. Not the way I should have done it, but the lack of a job on the far end definitely motivated me once I got to Atlanta. What I wish I had known was how to evaluate the culture of a company during the interview process. As I said a second ago, there was no real internet we know of as we know of it today, so data was kind of limited to personal interactions and marketing literature. The job I took with Accenture was a good learning experience, but the choice was less about consciously making a good decision and more about luck, to be honest. The move was a culture shock, but you're forced to adapt to the civilian environment pretty quickly. And I think one of the biggest adjustments I had to make was dealing with individuals who have been in the same role for 10 years or more. In the military, I was used to everyone changing jobs every year or two. And if you wanted to succeed, you had to be a team player. You were always going to be either new in a role or dealing with other individuals who were new in their role. And in the corporate world, it's not uncommon to be dealing with someone who's been in a role for a decade or more. It requires you to really think through your approach and realize there may be more long-term agendas at play. But I really wish I had known how to evaluate the culture of a company when looking at it and realize that you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, if not more.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's easy to slip into that mindset. From my own experience, this applies to both dating and job interviews. It's easy to slip into this mindset of let me sell this person on myself, or let me really go all out to get a possibility of a second date or a second interview. And I love what you're saying, which is it is about a mutual fit. And I think it shifts your mindset when you evaluate that interview as like, look, I am evaluating this company and like you said, the culture just as much as they're evaluating me. I think that can give you a real confidence boost, and it probably leads to better fits and taking jobs that you're better suited for.
It really does.
I would love to dive into more questions about your current role. But just to set the stage, could you share a little bit more for listeners who might not be familiar with New York Life Insurance Company?
Sure. New York Life is a 173-year-old mutual insurance company, which is to say it's owned by the members who have policies with it. It's in the 60s on the Fortune 100 list. It's got roughly 12,000 employees in corporate and another 12 to 15,000 agents. They're a relatively large and complex organization with several large ongoing initiatives, of which cybersecurity is one. And like any large company, they don't move exceptionally fast, but they have the resources to succeed at multiple complex initiatives simultaneously. And in my last role, after a period of doing the impossible with nothing, it's nice to have access to the tools and personnel to make move a strategy forward.
That's great. And so I said at the start that your title is Corporate Vice President of Cyber Incident Response. Could you break that down for us in terms of what that means that you do?
It really depends on what day of the week it is. My primary responsibility is leading the team that directs the investigation and cleanup after a cyber incident, whether that's relatively routine, like a phishing campaign that's been successful against a couple of our users, or advising a business unit that's had a key supplier suffer an incident that affects them. We're in the job of essentially doing the investigation and making sure everything is looked after properly and closed out the way it should. And when not directing response efforts, the team's engaged in everything from fielding new software related to our incident response program to really conducting cyber tabletop exercises with key leadership to attending industry conferences and training to stay on top of developments in the field. In a nutshell, I'm expected to be an expert on cybersecurity and able to provide advice and guidance across the organization on a number of different things that could happen involving cyber incidents, which is to say anything involving computer security or a computer system. Day-to-day life, that's really a lot of conference calls and WebExes.
And, the other thing I know that a lot of listeners enjoy is, because I get that your work really varies day to day, I know that a lot of listeners love to know the lifestyle associated. So could you speak maybe to kind of typical hours and travel and just kind of the lifestyle component of your work?
Sure. So I probably travel 1 week a month, and that may be anything from a 1 or 2 day trip to a full out on Monday, back on Friday. Hours, it really depends. If there are no breaking incidents, which is to say something we're actively investigating and not sure of where it's leading, it can be a 40-hour week. The last all-nighter I pulled was last August. It just really depends on what's going on, and it can be fairly unpredictable at times.
And I know that listeners, that many service members and veterans can be hesitant to put themselves out there on social media for concerns around operational security. Given your background in cybersecurity, do you have any thoughts about how they might approach that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and admit that I'm not a Facebook account holder. I don't have a Twitter account, and I don't care to know what the latest trending hashtag is. I have a LinkedIn account for professional purposes, but that's it. OPSEC for me was a minor consideration, but the main driver is that I just don't care what the majority of other people are doing. I really don't care what my coworker had for lunch or dinner, and my cousin's vacation pictures need to stay on their camera. I have a few good friends, and we catch up via phone, email, or once a month or so and figure out what's going on. From an OPSEC standpoint, all that activity really does draw attention, or I should have said makes researching your activity more easier. I've seen a number of incidents now where someone's online identity was taken over, and it's a nightmare. If you're going to maintain a social media presence, you definitely need to be aware of how to protect yourself, and you need to help educate your friends and family. And I'm seeing that more and more as time goes on.
I had my first interview 2 interviews ago with a lady named Lauren Burnell. She works in cybersecurity at FireEye, and it was really an eye-opening conversation in that the sense that I walked away from after our conversation was like, cybersecurity is a massive field that is only going to get bigger over time. And I also kind of walked away with this sense that a lot of veterans are probably very well suited to cybersecurity. It seems very mission oriented. It seems like their background in technology and some form of security would play well there. Could you share any thoughts about why listeners may be interested in a career in cybersecurity, and maybe even the flip side of that, why they may not want to be pursuing this sort of career?
Sure. It's kind of a complex question because they need to know themselves. And by that, I mean they need to know that they have an appetite for complex concepts and more than just a passing understanding of technology. Then they have to know if they're really more interested in the technology side or policy. And once you understand your own motivations, then you may look at cybersecurity. It's a really fast-paced field, and that sounds great when you're sitting around talking about it and the opportunities it may afford you, but you need to realize that also comes with a price. It's not uncommon to work longer hours. As I said a few minutes ago, I pulled an all-nighter back in early August, and I remember commenting when I got home the next morning that I was too old to be doing that, and really at some point I will be. If complex concepts and a human adversary, even indirectly, is exciting to you, this is definitely the field. If you want a very predictable day and you want to concentrate your energy in other areas of your life, maybe it isn't.
How did your military experience prepare you for this? And I'm curious, do you have any recommendations if someone wants to go in this career path, things they could be doing even right now on active duty to set themselves up for this sort of career?
Sure. There are all kinds of awareness courses and introduction to security courses that are available, I know, through the DoD. And not just the basic stuff, but the Army, the military in general, is more than happy to throw some fairly decent training at you. Even free training from the DoD has been fairly decent in basic concepts and understanding what the field looks like now and how it's growing and in what directions it's growing. There are an awesome number of online resources, blogs you can follow. Google is your friend, and just becoming aware of what the developments are in cybersecurity, what the big conversations are, the conversations around cloud security. being aware of all the aspects of it is your foot in the door. And the way the Army prepared me was a little different than, I would probably say most people can get prepared. And that's back in the early 2000s, I was a systems information officer. Cybersecurity wasn't a formal field at the time. And they created a new reserve unit that was looking at cybersecurity. And I happened to know some of the folks, and I got into it. And the training they gave us was more information technology training than security, and it started to morph into security over time. But really, I bounced back and forth between the Army training and my civilian training, and just became more aware to the point where I realized I actually was the expert in the office at it, and that led to a formal career inside of cybersecurity.
And I'm aware as we're chatting about this, you are in a very senior position at a very, very large, influential company. And I imagine that you have a lot of insights into some of the trends going on with cybersecurity. And I'm curious if anything stands out, and I'm thinking of even veteran listeners who may be working at other companies right now. Any thoughts that you have on what are some of the bigger either software security risks or just cybersecurity risks in general facing companies today?
Yeah, so, two of the big trends that I see now are as more infrastructure and applications move to the cloud, more businesses see the savings, the aspects of moving their infrastructure to the cloud. Cloud security is becoming a huge part of the whole security field, and a lot of it is working in conjunction with the infrastructure and application specialists who are moving their components to the cloud and trying to fix some of the security vulnerabilities that they have and that they've known about for a while during that move. So they're taking the opportunity as they move their infrastructure and applications to the cloud to fix some of these security holes they have. But they really need to understand how security in the cloud works to make that successful. And that's an easy partnership between infrastructure, applications, and security to make that happen. The other piece is really software security, and it's getting more attention, but up until very recently, a software developer's goal was to produce software or a component or a module that worked, not a secure component. The emphasis there was on worked. Now the concept of a secure development life cycle is gaining ground, but it's going to take a while. Unlike TV, not every developer is a strung-out pizza eating machine that lives to stay on top of their field. Most have been doing this for years now, and learned habits stay there for a long time. Their learned habit is to just make the module work, not take security into consideration as a primary aspect of their development. And then add to this the fact that most non-developers don't realize that new software is really rarely entirely new. It builds on or interfaces with existing code that may have been written years ago. And it might even be that the code you're working on had a problem, but you don't know it, and you might inadvertently expose an issue with somebody else's.
That brings up another question is, I think you're making a strong case for how big this is. And for people listening, they could be in any role at a company, executive management to customer support even. Do you have any advice for them on how to get their team on board with the importance of software and cybersecurity?
Oh, definitely. The first rule is don't ever assume that anyone really understands the risks, and that includes the person sitting next to you. You have to make it personal, and you have to make it relevant to them. And you have to constantly tailor your message, which can be a little exhausting, but you get used to it. If you put it in terms people understand, they start to get it. The software developer doesn't want to be identified as the individual that engineered in a critical flaw. And on the other end of the spectrum, board members of multi-billion-dollar companies watched Equifax unfold with absolute horror. And they don't want to be at the helm of a crisis of that magnitude. You can have the discussions all day long over what could and could not have been realistically done, but you're having the conversation. At that point, you have their attention. You need to tailor your message at that point to be relevant to your audience. and then be ready for an intelligent discussion. You can't just drop the subject on them and then back off. You have to make it relevant, and you have to be intelligent about your discussion, and be ready to back what you're saying up.
And as part of that, I'm wondering, I imagine that you do a lot of work to stay ahead of this and stay informed. Are there any resources you would recommend to listeners that could be online courses or books or podcasts or conferences and anything that might help them educate themselves on this subject?
It really depends on which aspect of the field you're in. If you're in some of the more technical sides of the field, the SANS courses are really pretty decent. They can be kind of expensive, so if you can get your company or employer to send you to one, they are an awesome, usually about a 5-day course, and some of the experts that present in those courses are really at the pinnacle of the field. Other resources, if you're really starting off on the cheap, you don't have a couple $1,000s to throw at a course, start reading through a lot of the online material. And even websites like SANS have a free component that will start giving you a primer on what's important in any particular component of security you're looking at, whether it's penetration testing or application security development or just policies and procedures. There are a lot of background documents you can read, and the more information you have, the more you orient yourself to the field, the more you will start to realize what part of it really appeals to you and what part of it you need to concentrate on.
And you kind of rattled off a couple there. Could you give us a little bit of the lay of the land? I know that I keep on using cybersecurity, which I'm realizing is an incredibly broad term. How do you see it as what are the different groups or different areas that people could investigate to see if that is a good fit for them?
Oh my goodness, there is everything from the technical aspects of it, which really are the hands-on, fingers on the keyboard component, all the way on one end to policy on the other. And really the hands-on keyboard aspect are the ones that probably get the most play. And the SANS courses are good for really orienting yourselves to what the different components are, whether it's penetration testing where you're trying to test, security of a website or security of an application, to data security, to actual application security, how to engineer it in. All the different technical aspects are really a lot of fun. But then on the other end of the spectrum, there's the policy aspects, because most larger companies have policies and procedures that dictate how the different technical components work together and what's required and what's not. Companies don't just throw policies out there. They actually put thought behind them and try to tailor them to their specific company. And that is a real expertise that in a lot of cases doesn't get a lot of airtime, because everybody wants to see the flashy hands-on keyboard and scrolling screens. But in reality, if you don't have policies that make sense for a company, then a lot of the users and the people that need those policies just ignore them. If they don't make sense, then they don't get followed. So you need people who are intelligent enough to know the company and know security and know technology, and blend the three together to make a policy that makes sense for the company, the technology, and the people that work there.
That's great. And I also wanted to ask about, you've had such an interesting career leading up to this, and you've served as CIO multiple times. Could you talk a little bit more about what a CIO is and what they do and what that experience was like for you?
Sure. It really means different things at different companies. But in the 2 CIO roles that I had, I led the technology in the firm I was at. And that means infrastructure, applications, data storage, development, everything. I tried to balance my time in the role to be 50% focused on making sure that different functions were heading in the right direction, and then the other 50% talking to the business to develop really a roadmap and build consensus on where technology and the company needed to go to stay ahead of their requirements. And it's an awesome amount of fun, and I hope I get the opportunity to do it again at least one more time with a good team. But like any role, a good team makes all the difference when you're a CIO, and building a good team is one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. Really, leading the technology in an organization is reading people's minds. It's sitting down with the business leaders and trying to figure out where they are taking their component of the business so you can stay ahead of it, because nothing feels worse than sitting down and realizing that the business is waiting on technology to catch up. But like reading people's minds, like, in any relationship, there's some risk there. So you have to really be a good reader of people and figure out what they're actually trying to do and what they're trying to tell you, and whether you need to believe them now or whether you need to try to believe what they may not be telling you, if that makes any sense.
That's great. That's great. I was curious because, again, this is just a guess from an outsider's perspective, but I'm imagining when you were in those chief information officer roles that it's incredibly far-reaching. It's very broad. You're doing lots of different things at an exceptionally high level, and then to see it seems like you switched and transitioned to a very specific aspect of what you were doing previously, and really going deeper on the cybersecurity aspect of things. And I'm curious how you approach that decision. First of all, I'm curious if you think that's accurate, and then second of all, how you approach that decision to increase the specificity of your work and to transition from those broader CIO roles.
It really was on purpose. So back in the late 90s, mid 90s, cybersecurity really wasn't that big of a thing. It was more of an afterthought. So the concentration was really the focus was on IT operations, getting technology infrastructure up and running. And it was an absolute lot of fun. And the CIO role is an outgrowth of that, and really, manages that across an organization. The computer security side, when I was in the Army Reserve, that's where it really started. And what I learned on the security side was, I don't know how anyone understands security without having done operations. It's just, I grew up with technology. My first computer was a Timex Sinclair 1000 back in the early 80s. I got to live building computer systems. I got to live networking them. I got to live the early days of the internet. It was an unbelievable amount of fun, but I got to live a lot of I got to experience firsthand all those different aspects of computing. I still remember a 300 baud modem. Security is really a different take on technology, and that is, it's not the operating of technology, it's how do you get something out of it you weren't supposed to, whether that's information or mostly information, right? So when I was doing computer security with the Army Reserve back in the early 2000s, I found it intensely interesting. And over the last couple of roles, as I was doing technology operations as a CIO, it made me realize that computer security, operations is becoming much more automated. It's becoming much, I don't want to say easier because it's not necessarily easier, but the emphasis is drifting away from operations as we find ways to make it more efficient. But security was just a wide open hole. And when I was at my last role, it was a startup and it was a lot of fun. We had a good team. However, we were constantly doing everything with nothing. And when I was looking for opportunities, I realized I'm 48. I've still got another 15, 20 years. Do I want to try and carve out a niche in technology operations and keep going there, or move over to what I was seeing as a growth field? So I looked at cybersecurity and said, I can do this. It's a lot of fun, and I can move my primary focus from operations to cybersecurity. That's really how I made that decision.
That's such a great explanation. It seems like you really, as your career developed, you really had this exposure to see this, emerging field that, like you said, did not exist couple decades ago. And I love the distinction you make there between the operational aspect and the security aspect, and seeing like this is going to be a really big and continuously growing field. And it seems like you had a lot of foresight in making that jump and making that transition, because it does seem like this is a field that will just become more and more pertinent to every single company.
It really does.
Could you speak a little bit about, you have had an impressive civilian career, and at the same time you've maintained your military service in the Army Reserves. And could you just talk about what that was like, staying in the reserves, and especially for people who are thinking of getting out right now from active duty, any advice to them on how to approach that decision of to continue with the reserves or not?
I'm not going to lie. It was much more difficult at times than I realized it was going to be. When I came off active duty in 1996, I'll be honest, I had absolutely no idea what the reserves were about, nor did I necessarily want to be a part of them. I thought it was just active duty, and then I didn't even draw a good distinction in my mind between the reserves and the National Guard. But when I was out processing, I went through the reserve recruiter as one of the stations, and he said, "Hey, there's this unit down where you're going. We'll try and, if you're interested, we'll have them contact you, maybe bring you, on orders and figure out if you want to be a part of the reserves." I said, "Yeah, sure." He said, "If you get your orders and it says individual ready reserve, they didn't go through, and don't worry about it." Okay, not a problem. Well, about 6 months later, I started getting no pay due LESs from this unit. And after 3 or 4 of those, the SGLI component debt was adding up, and I decided to call the unit and figure out what was going on. And they said, "Oh, if you've got a uniform, throw it on, get a haircut, come on in, and we'll figure it out. And if nothing else, you'll drill for us for 1 weekend, and that should take care of your SGLI debt." And the colonel that was down there at the unit talked me into sticking around in the reserves for a little while and figuring out if I liked it or not. And what I realized was I missed the camaraderie and the team aspect of the military. So I decided to stick around in the reserves. And when 9/11 happened, that's when really the op tempo picked up. Prior to 9/11, the reserves was really a 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year job. And I had a lot of fun throwing on my uniform 1 weekend a month. The pay was okay, but really staying in touch with everybody and being a part of a team was appealing to me. After 9/11, it got a little bit more difficult, and really as the op tempo picked up, there were some times where I look back and I was pulling 120 days of duty a year and a civilian job, and I don't think either side, the military or the civilian side, realizes how much time you're putting in on both sides. The reserves always seem to think they're the most important thing in the room, and you should just drop whatever you're doing on the civilian side, and you can drop whatever you're doing on the civilian side and go do a military mission. And the civilians, on the other hand, kind of look at it as, well, why is this 1 weekend a month, or why are these times, why are you unavailable to do our primary job? So you have to balance that, and it's a continual balancing. If you work it right, though, you can work it to your advantage on both sides. And by that I mean the military values your civilian career. A lot of what the active Army does in the communications and the cyber world moves very slowly compared to the civilian world. So the Army Reserve and the military in general looks at your civilian experience, and they want it. They covet it. They realize that you are going to be a premier expert in what you're doing, probably more so than the guys who are on active duty, supposedly doing it every day, when in reality, what they may do during any given week is a small component of what you do on the civilian side. And the civilians, there's a badge of honor for having military in their organization. They look at you as, hey, this person's really stepping up, and they're doing a lot, especially with some of the older management in the company who remember Vietnam. They remember some of our past conflicts, and they remember their parents being in the military. They may have been in the military themselves, and they look at you as, hey, this person's really doing what they need to do. We know they're going to be a team player. We know they're going to be loyal, and we know they're always going to get the mission done. And if you work that aspect of the relationship, you will be fine. If you use one side to play against the other, like I've seen done in the past, sooner or later it's going to bite you. And by that I mean if you in the reserves schedule your 2 weeks or manage to have something come up during a big project, and you essentially are seen by your civilian team as bailing so that you can go to your military duty. And in the military, if you aren't available for an exercise because you've got a big civilian project coming up, then it's going to be to your detriment. But really, if you want it to work, it'll work. If you want to play both sides against each other, sooner or later it's going to squish you.
That's great. I think that's one of the best perspectives I've had on the show about the reserves. And another thing I wanted to ask about is that I'm guessing that in your civilian career you've run across or hired or managed other military veterans, and then in your work with the reserves you're probably exposed to a lot of veterans who are making this transition. You've probably seen, you yourself have experienced multiple transitions from military, and you've probably been exposed to others doing it. And I was just wondering if anything stands out to you as common mistakes that veterans make when they are leaving the military, or even any common misconceptions they may have about what their life is going to be like on the civilian side. And I'm just asking that, thinking of those people who might be listening, who are on active duty, who are in the process of getting out, trying to give them any sort of gouge on mistakes to avoid or to anticipate.
I can say common misperceptions on both sides are, if you're on active duty, you look at civilians and you say, oh, you guys you're on the gravy train. You're rolling in at 9, you leave at 4 or 5, and you've got every weekend off, and you don't have to worry about deployments, and it's all gravy. When in fact, when you're on the civilian side, you look at the military and you say, what do you mean you're off on a 4-day weekend again? You've got a 4-day holiday, or you're off training Wednesdays or whatever the training day is per week. In reality, both sides work equally hard. And a civilian, I show up every day between 6:45 and 7 o'clock in the morning. I usually leave between 4 and 5. It's common for me to be traveling 1 week a month, no matter, it might not be Kuwait or Afghanistan or Iraq, but it's still a week away from home. You're still TDY. From a civilian standpoint, one of the biggest mistakes that I see veterans make when they are transitioning is to overstate their experience in the military. And I don't mean that if you've really done the job, you've really done it. But I don't know how many times I've interviewed folks and I look at their experience and they say, yeah, I was at a battalion and I wrote regulations and I wrote Army policy. And I'm looking at them thinking, no, in 123 Field Artillery Battalion, trust me, you did not write Army doctrine or Army regulations. You did a job, but don't overstate what your experience is, because there are enough former military or reservists out there who can look at your resume and call BS. And it's really not uncommon. My shop here at New York Life, I'm counting on my hand here, I've got 5 former military, and some of them may have been, they haven't touched a uniform since the early 90s, but they still know how to smell BS. And one of the terms we use for it is, this guy was the door gunner on a space shuttle. There's no way, you look at the resume and you say, I know they didn't do all this. There's no way. They were an E5. Mm-hmm. They did not have this level of responsibility. So that is going to show up very quickly. And if it doesn't show up during the interview process and you get hired, then you've been hired with false expectations. And you need to be very careful about that, because that's going to make for a very ugly transition not too long past that.
The parallels to dating continue. Overselling can backfire. I love that phrase too. Was it door gunner on a spaceship?
Yeah, door gunner on the space shuttle. You look at him and you say, there's no way they do. This guy was a computer expert, but he was kicking in doors with the SEALs. I'm betting there are very, very few of those, especially when I'm looking at this guy's resume and he was stationed, on a destroyer someplace. I'm like, no, he wasn't kicking in doors with the SEALs in Afghanistan. He was, he was in the comm center, or he might have been in charge of communications on the ship. But no, these stories don't make sense. And once you stop trusting somebody, you're not going to hire them.
That's awesome. Well, I know that we've covered a lot of ground, and I just appreciate your perspective between talking about cybersecurity and the CIO experience and reserves. But I'm sure that there's things I didn't ask about that you would like to share with listeners. And so I'd love to just keep the last question open-ended and say, what have we not covered that you want to make sure that listeners walk away with before we wrap up?
Transitioning from the military to the civilian world is not that complex, but it is a mind shift. There are some things you just have to realize you don't deal with in the military world that it's going to be your bread and butter in the civilian world. And one of those really is budgeting. And the reason I say that is I've been in budgeting hell for about 2 weeks now. In most military jobs, you don't have to actively fight for money for programs, for whatever you're doing. You're given a budget or you're told what the parameters are. You might have to fight for little pieces, but you literally don't have to fight for millions of dollars and then show detailed results on what you got for that money. And that is something you are going to have to wrap your heads around as you transition out of the military. Budgeting is a key component of almost every single civilian job. Unless you are just in an absolute entry-level position, at some point fairly early on, you're going to be asked for budget input. So wrap your head around it and ask questions. Understand how your company does it, because that is one aspect of the military life that at almost every level I see, whether you're an E1 or an 06, you're coming off active duty. Most people don't have a good concept of how the civilian world does budgeting. And I'm not talking about the nuts and bolts, but I'm just talking the entire process, how that works and how you have to fight for money to be able to do your job within a company.
That's such a great distinction. It is, you're right, that's something that very few, maybe outside of supply corps type things, very few people in the military have that experience with the fighting for resources and allocation of them. And I think that's great for listeners to keep in mind, that that's a potential blind spot or a skill set they're going to have to very quickly build up after that transition.
It's definitely key to success.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate your time today. I appreciate your perspective, and thank you so much for sharing your story with the Beyond the Uniform audience today.
Thanks for having me on.
Surface.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond the Uniform. There are over 200 free episodes at beyondtheuniform.io. They're classified by the industry of focus, the functional role the person plays, and more. Beyond the Uniform is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Justin Asiri. Our Director of Outreach, responsible for sponsorship and guest episodes, is Steve Bain. Our editor, responsible for the show notes and text transcripts for all episodes, is Kathleen Dillon. Our data analytics and insights advisor is Andrew Woolridge. If you are enjoying Beyond the Uniform, you can help us out by telling your veterans and friends in the military about this free resource. There is more information on the website about how you can sponsor an episode or donate to our program to help us grow the work that we're doing. Be sure to check out the coaching section of beyondtheuniform.io, where you can be paired with professional, subsidized coaches to help you figure out your next career move. You can sign up for our newsletter to be up to date on the latest happenings at Beyond the Uniform. And in each show notes section, there is a link to audible.com, which is providing a free audiobook of your choice to Beyond the Uniform listeners. You get a free book of your choosing, and Beyond the Uniform gets $15 to subsidize the cost of the show, regardless of whether you continue with audible.com or not. Check that out and more in the show notes for this episode. Keep the feedback coming. Let me know what resources would help you in your career, and we'll do our best to make that happen. Take care, be safe, and I'll be back next week with more interviews with military veterans about their civilian career.